a lot of physicians, as they move into leadership roles, they have this piece around imposter syndrome, right? And I think potentially women have that more than men. I'm not sure, but I think I've seen it in both men and women where they are not really sure they should be at that leadership table, and so therefore they shrink a little bit and aren't as bold. Or the opposites of that is people overestimate and sort of dominate and cause speak out of turn. So you got to find the right presence for you as you move into these leadership roles.
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Craig Wright, who is a practicing physician for many years and also has had a long leadership career with Providence Health System here in the Northwest, and then was the Chief Medical Officer at the Portland Clinic and is now the Chief Medical Officer at Waterfall Community Health Center, which is one of the federally qualified health centers here in Oregon. Craig also has a national consultancy as an executive coach working with physicians and healthcare leaders. And on top of that, in his spare time, he works with the Health Management Academy, also serves on several boards of health systems and national quality organizations. And my very favorite part about the introduction of Craig is that I'm delighted that I get to work with him on our Physician Leadership Project, which is a year-long program for high potential leaders here in the Northwest. So Craig, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks, Joe. It's always good to spend time with you, and thanks for the very flattering introduction. It's just a joy to be with you today.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Well, we'll jump right in because you and I have had a lot of conversations about physician leadership and developing physicians as leaders. So I'd love to start with the very basic fundamental question of, in your opinion, what makes for a successful physician leader?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. Physician leadership, I think, is super important right now. It's always been important, but as healthcare continues to evolve and change, having effective clinical leadership is in the voice of decision making and direction is always important. So, what makes a good physician leader? I think it's a variety of things. Clinically, certainly. You have to be at a certain level and have respect of your peers. But leadership is a whole different set of skills in the clinical side, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit. The difference between the leadership world and the clinical world. But I think an effective physician leader has respect and integrity, has ability to communicate effectively, can think about the big picture and also understand sort of how things play out at the direct patient care level. And so being able to bring all those voices together and grow your influence. John Maxwell talks a lot about leadership is influence, and so a good physician leader is able to develop his or her influence across whatever organization they're in or outside the organization also, and be able to use that influence to move the organization, move things in a positive direction.
Excellent. We do talk a lot about influence. So as you've observed physician leaders over the years, what is it that you see that makes a physician want to move into leadership?
Yeah, it's a good question. Also, leadership probably isn't for everyone who's a clinician, but I think it's maybe a growing area overall. And I think that there's a piece around wanting to have your voice heard at a bigger table, to move from sort of the day-to-day work of taking care of patients, one patient, one family at a time, which is super important and always will be important, I think, in healthcare. And to be able to do an additional layer of leading an organization, once again having some input and influence into where an organization's going, or where the healthcare policy debate's going, or whatever leadership you step into, but just to have a bigger impact on a different level than the day-to-day interaction. And it's super rewarding. It's something I personally have enjoyed over many years, being able to have a voice in the leadership table. And it's also very different than the day-to-day and patient care work which is also joyful and brings a lot of value. So having a foot in both camps is also really fun.
Yeah. Well, I've been impressed just thinking about your career trajectory and all of the impact that you've had over the years with all of your various different leadership roles. And like you say, different from what your impact is as a physician, sort of one patient, one family at a time, to stepping into a leadership role. So that's a great segue for us to think a little bit about some of the differences between working as a physician and working as a leader. You and I have a nice slide that we use to talk about this in the Physician Leadership Project. But maybe talk about that a little bit. Like how did you find it different?
Yeah, it is different work. A lot of it is around the language, right? And so, as a physician or a clinician, you learn a different language, and when you're in leadership roles or business meetings or board meetings, it's a different language that is being used. So being understand the financial language as well as other organizational language to bring some credibility to the conversation, I think is important. None of that is super complex, or as we like to say, it's not rocket science. It's stuff that you can pick up if you spend some time and energy learning the finance basics and be able to speak to it. And I think it makes your voice more powerful as a physician leader if you do understand what it means, what a net income means, or what a margin means, or how things work to the variances in the budget, those kinds of things. So I think that's part of the differences, being able to use the language differently. It's also sort of understanding the politics isn't quite the right word, but organizational dynamics and who has influence, and how do you grow your influence in what oftentimes is very complex organizations. Healthcare organizations are some of the biggest companies in the world, and so understanding in these big complex organizations, how do you grow your influence? Even if you're in a small independent private practice, they get complex pretty quickly. Between the front desk and the back office and the clinicians, and so just thinking about the organizational dynamics and how do you grow your influence and relationships to be able to add value once again. And all physicians are leaders. They set the tone in their practice and how they engage with others. And so I think that's a concept that's important for physicians in particular to understand also.
Absolutely. Well, then that's a good place to pivot a little bit and talk about some of the difficult things that physicians encounter in making that transition from the day-to-day and the one-on-one to the longer term and the one-on-N, if you will.
Yeah. So what some of the challenges are, I think the challenges are can be varied, right? And so it depends on where you start and how. I think there's some physicians in particular and clinicians, and I kind of use those interchangeable these days. But I do think physicians are a bit of a unique position. But they, where you start from, what skills you bring to the table, what kind of executive presence or communication skills you have to start with, and how you grow that, and how you find the right mentors and the right coaches. Sometimes it can be really helpful to help you with a transition, and a lot of as you look back on your career, you notice that there's things that you get really good at doing, and understand how you win in that, and practicing medicine oftentimes is one of those that you know how to do that really well, and then you step into this new world, and then everything is a little bit different, and you're not sure how you're going to succeed, or if you're going to succeed, or if you even should be at the table at times, and so sort of making that curve from moving into something new and different is, I think, a challenge for all of us if you're going from clinical to something else, administrative, but also it's, as you get really good at one administrative role and it's time to grow and change to something else, that you still kind of go through those transition curves where you leave something that you're good at and understand to something that you don't really understand as well. And so that, I think that's an important concept for us all to think about.
That's a great thought too. And just there's that sort of that first transition from, practicing clinical medicine to switching over to leadership and administration. And then, yeah, there's a whole career path there with, like you say, some very different roles and ways in which people can continue to challenge themselves. You said right at the beginning of that something about executive presence. So I had a question for you about that too. Executive presence, when people ask me to describe it, I always feel like it's a little ethereal, a little bit like you know it when you see it, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
when you're working with your clients and you're helping them to develop executive presence, how do you talk about that with them, and how would you recommend that people in our audience who want to develop their executive presence go about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to it. A lot of it sort of boils down to how you communicate in some ways, and that's not just using your words. Words are always important, and thinking about that, as we talked about, being able to use a language of business when you're in a business setting is part of it. But we communicate through a lot of nonverbal pieces. So how you sit in your chair, and who you make eye contact, even who you sit next to and who you don't sit next to. Those are all sort of part of your presence, and sort of having this confidence. I think a lot of physicians, as they move into leadership roles, they have this piece around imposter syndrome, right? And I think potentially women have that more than men. I'm not sure, but I think I've seen it in both men and women where they are not really sure they should be at that leadership table, and so therefore they shrink a little bit, and aren't as bold. Or the opposites of that is people overestimate and sort of dominate and cause speak out of turn. So you got to find the right presence for you as you move into these leadership roles. And I think a lot of that is sort of once again, how do you think about where you add value and how you do that, and being able to sit tall, look people in the eye, be able to speak the language and speak so people can hear. Even I've seen a lot of folks who just don't speak loudly enough, and people aren't heard and things
Literally
like that.
a volume issue. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so and once again, that's true in big meetings, but also it's true in one-on-one or small meetings, and just how you're perceived, I think, is something that we all should think about as leaders, and continue to develop and think about as how do we be more effective leaders by increasing your presence.
Yeah. Well, and it's along the lines of speaking loudly enough. The other piece, and my mother always used to get after us for this, is enunciate. And
Yeah,
so I probably have to give her credit. And so she was right, yeah. Speak loudly enough to be heard and speak clearly so everyone can understand you. Yeah.
exactly.
Don't sit at the board table and mumble. That's
No, that's
oh, so great. And some of the things are like that. They seem very, sort of fundamental and yet really crucial. And people notice when they're missing, If someone's not speaking loudly enough, they get talked over or sort of pushed aside inside of a meeting if there are louder voices or stronger voices. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think we all have emotions as we're sitting at the table too, right? And
sure.
some things we're anxious or excited or mad or happy, and so figuring out how you manage those emotions in the moment, I think, are also important part of being your executive presence.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about um, developing confidence by like learning the language and speaking the language that's being spoken around the room. So if you're in a clinical conversation, you're speaking a clinical language. If you're in a financial conversation, you're speaking a financial language. So learning that, which we often say, not rocket science, like you said. That's straightforward. It's different, and we don't teach a lot of that in medical school. So I keep
No.
I keep asking around. Is it are we doing any business training in medical school yet? So I may have to go ask that at the medical schools and see how we can help. But
Yeah, yeah, and to add to that, I think that's very true. I do think that being succinct is important, and stating what you want to say and say it once, and say it well, and we never say it perfectly, but good is good enough, kind of thing. But in medical school, we're all taught to how to present a clinical case in rounds, and I think that's a pretty succinct and standardized way of being able to do things. And so using some of those skills, I think, once again, to be precise and succinct when you're in the meetings, not saying the same thing two or three times, because that starts to turn folks off too.
yeah. Well, and to your point, the you made me just think about this. The SOAP note and the S bar are not too far apart. If we think about abbreviations for clinical documentation and abbreviations for business documentation, yeah, similar and yes, succinct, meant to get to the point. So wonderful. Well, now if somebody were looking to develop their executive presence, what one or two things would you say for them to focus on?
One or two things. Well, I think growing some insight in how you're perceived today is probably one thing.
Mhm.
Having some sense of that, and you get that by talking to the others, or once again finding mentors or people that you like and respect, and getting a cup of coffee with them, and having conversations about how you feel like you're perceived today. I think that's a place to start, so you know where to begin. And we all bring good things to this table, so understand where your strengths and where your blind spots are, I think, is a good part of it. Spending in, once again, if you're doing organizational work, understanding the finance language, I think, is important. If you're doing policy reform, quality work, understand that language well too. And then yeah, once again, I think coaching and other sort of input, you need people who tell you the truth, speak the truth to you, and not sugarcoat things, and is watching you from a different eye, because in the moment you don't know how you're being perceived. And so I think those are places to start, but it's a sort of a lifelong journey. It's something that I've
Yes.
been working on, and we're forever learners in this area.
Yeah, that's well said. I was speaking a little while ago with a executive with one of the medical groups here who's been in a leadership role for 30 plus years, and she mentioned something she'd gotten from her executive coach, and I was pleasantly surprised to hear that she was still at her stage of her career, very, very experienced, still working with an executive coach because she's newer in a role, been there about a year, and she's just ended by saying, I have a lot to learn, still. And learning how to show up differently with a different group of leaders for her has been really, really helpful. So, flipping a little bit more to some of the challenges for leaders, one of the things that you've said many times is you get what you tolerate. So, could you speak to that from a leadership perspective a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Usually, what I mean when we say that is around sort of managing other clinicians or physicians, and as I said earlier, the physicians are leaders, and they also set the tone. And so, if you have somebody who's speaking disrespectful or doing things that everyone knows is not positive for the organization, and you don't address those, then that you'll get more of that. And so, so we talk a lot in our physician leadership project around, sometimes molehills are good to start to address before they become mountains. And so, if you see something that doesn't sit quite right with you, don't make a big deal of it, but mention it and make sure it's noted that you recognized it. I think can be helpful, because when you're sort of conflict avoidant, then things tend to grow and expand, and it's sort of this big blow up that happens that if you're in a different conversation earlier on may have been able to prevented. So I think that is a lot of physicians are in places where they're managing other clinicians, other physicians, and so tolerating behavior that is not positive, causes problems. And at the same time, as a physician, that there's bad days and people are not always at their best. So,
Exactly.
and so when do you have the conversation, I think is a challenge. And that's part of the art of leadership too.
And that's a great distinction to make. If someone's having, as we like to say, if someone's having a bad hair day, you can let one or two things go by. But if it seems to be a bad hair week or a bad hair month, then it's time to sort of keep those guardrails in place, and let them know what's acceptable to the rest of the organization and what isn't. And
Right.
I like your molehill and mountain comment, that those are things we frequently will let them slide because it's easier, and maybe it is just a bad hair day. But then the molehill starts to get larger. What is it? What do we call it when it's between a molehill and a mountain? I don't know. It's like the foothills or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, yeah.
You feel yourself approaching the foothills. Time to turn around. We do
But
talk.
but
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I do think that it takes energy to do that, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to, you're tired yourself and dealing with a bunch of stuff, and to be able to deal with conflict does take energy. But the more you kind of get comfortable with it, the better, easier it is.
It is a little easier, and you also learn. Unfortunately, I know most of us have learned the hard way that becomes a mountain quickly, and then it takes a lot more energy to have that
Yeah,
conversation. And
right.
we talk a lot about the critical conversations, and not critical in the sense of negative, but critical in the sense of important. And keeping those things. Yeah. Talk early and often when you need to have those, right? But minor course corrections are a lot easier than the major
Right.
communication. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, oh, that's great. Well, and the other thing I know we talk about a lot in the Physician Leadership Project is just by virtue of the physician's training that they are a leader already, and sort of always a leader. So that's, and sometimes I think we have physicians and clinicians that don't recognize that. They just don't think of themselves that way. And maybe that gets back to a little bit of the imposter syndrome we were talking about. But it is a leadership role, kind of whether you like it or not. And
Right. Exactly.
that
But
people are always listening and looking. So yeah. Well,
and
we've touched a couple of times on um, the finance piece of the learning about leadership and business ownership, if you will. And so, since this podcast is about all things financial around a physician's practice, what advice would you have for our audience about learning about practice finance?
yeah, that's good. Yeah, and this is I get the money matters, so that's important,
Yeah.
and I think it does matter. It can. So I think thinking about the importance of finance money does matter, and having sustainability does matter, and there's always this tension in organizations around. How much can you pay people? How much can you invest in the future? How much can you do that has sort of a negative bottom line impact, but still important to do? And so I think, as depends on where you're at in your leadership journey, but the more you get comfortable with those tensions, the more you understand the financial pieces, I think the more effective you'll be in helping make good stewardship and decisions that make the organization sustainable. And finances are not, they are complicated, especially in big, complex organizations, but they're not that complicated in the sense that there's revenues coming in and there's expenses going out, and you want to have something at the bottom line. And so I think those are the basic concepts. The revenues minus expenses equals bottom line, and so understanding why it's important to have a bottom line. Understanding how to read a spreadsheet that has different expenses and different revenues, so you can ask the right questions. I think those are really good things, because you will see things as a physician leader that others will not see or not understand the same way. And so I think that bringing that perspective and knowing that you're that you can add value in those conversations. But if all you ever say is we got to spend more money on quality or pay our physicians more, if that's the only voice that you have, you'll lose some of your credibility. So I think you have to have some sense of how do you get to those things. Those are still important things to do oftentimes. But being in that conversation from a good steward position is really helpful.
Absolutely, and having sort of balanced input, that you're not only always carrying one flag, but that you can go in with a lot of different and a little bit more global oversight of the finances, be perceived that way. It struck me while you were talking that having physician voices at the table brings a very valuable perspective. And I think frequently, if physicians feel like they don't quite understand all of the financial underpinnings, they will sometimes hesitate and not speak up. And I think having the clinical perspective at the table in those finance discussions is really key for organizations. And also, as you and I have seen in the Physician Leadership Project, having the courage to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't understand this financial metric, or I don't understand your analysis. Would you please go through it, step by step, or something? To understand there are probably multiple people in the room with the same question that you have, and having that courage to ask it. And to be a little bit vulnerable, to say, I really don't understand this return on investment calculation, or whatever you might be discussing, is of huge value to your colleagues and your organization, because a lot of times financial people are presenting, assuming that everybody's on the same page, and it's not always the case. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I always encourage physicians, no matter where they're at in their leadership role and what organization they're in, is to figure out who is the person who's running the finance, and make them develop your relationship with them. So in big organizations, there's a CFO around somewhere, and in smaller organizations, it may be the clinic administrator or somebody. But there's tensions there, right? That they view the world differently than you do. But get beyond that and spend time with them, and because I think over time you can become their best asset as far as being able to understand how things, and vice versa. They become your best asset. And so I think that's not a natural relationship in a lot of places, but make a point of trying to develop those relationships so you can understand each other's roles a little bit differently.
It's a great piece of advice. Yeah, you want that to be a healthy, symbiotic relationship, not a one that's negative or combative in any way. Although you do come at things very differently. I know as a finance person, some of the best perspective shifts I've been able to achieve have been because a physician was asking questions from his or her perspective, and it just gave me a totally different understanding of how we look at an issue or an item or an investment, and what the priorities are. So, that's been really helpful. Well, this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. You and I could talk for days on this topic. I know. We've gotten a good solid 30 minutes, which is great. But so what final pearls of wisdom would you share with physicians who are contemplating a move toward leadership roles?
Yeah, well, I've talked to it a little bit. I think I'd go back to it's meaningful work. You can make a big impact and have a lot of satisfaction and leave a legacy in many ways. So it's good work to do, and it's complicated work. It's not. It's a different world that you have to start to appreciate on some level. And then the counterbalances to that is walk into it with confidence and grow your presence, and you have a lot to add, and so sort of balancing all those things about learning and having confidence as you learn and want to do this work. I think those are sort of the three pillars, if you will, about why you'd want to do this. And once again, I think it's super important right now for every organization, no matter what the size, is to have effective clinical leadership because the decisions are getting more complex rather than less complex. The stakes feel like they're getting higher in some ways, and I really want healthcare to have a clinical voice, because I think better decisions get made over the long run, and we serve our communities better, and we reach out to those who need care more. I think those are all part of the clinical leadership view. So it's good work, and find some friends as you go along, but make it, if you want to do it, there's a lot of rewards that come out of it.
Wonderful. Craig, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of your expertise.
No, it's my pleasure. It's fun to talk with you.
All right. Thank you. You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can sign up to be notified when the contracting visualizer tool is ready for purchase. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you and send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.